There's a book that almost nobody has read. Not because it's boring, not because it's lost, but because a very long time ago someone decided you weren't supposed to. Tonight I want to tell you about it, and I want you to get comfortable first. Fluff the pillow, pull the blanket up to your chin, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, the way they never quite do during the day, because this is a slow story, a quiet one, the kind that's meant to be listened to in the dark with your eyes already closing. There's nothing here to startle you, no loud turns, just a soft, strange mystery unfolding one gentle piece at a time, and my voice walking beside you into it. So let me tell you what makes this book so odd. It's old. Older than most of the Bible you think you know. Some scholars believe it was written more than 2,000 years ago, and there are hints it may reach back even further than that, into traditions older still. But age isn't the strange part. Lots of things are old. Here's the strange part. This book claims to contain a timeline that was written before the first human being ever drew breath. Think about that for a moment, slowly, the way you'd turn something over in your hands. History, recorded before history, events set down in order before there was anyone alive to witness them. A calendar of everything that would happen, supposedly etched somewhere safe, before Adam opened his eyes for the very first time, according to the book at least. Nobody can say for certain how any of it came to be. That's part of what keeps pulling people back to it, century after century. Before we go any further, though, I want to do the thing I always do. I want to know where you are right now, because somewhere out there you're lying in the dark, listening to me, and you're not alone. Someone else is doing the exact same thing, in a completely different corner of the world. So if you'd be so kind, leave a comment and tell me your city and your local time as you're drifting off. I love reading them. It's the loveliest feeling. It'll be 1 in the morning in a quiet flat in London, and someone else will be listening over their breakfast coffee in Sydney, and another person will be curled up at dusk in a little town in Ohio, all of us tucked into the same slow story at the same moment, scattered across the whole turning planet. Berlin at midnight, Manila at dawn. You, wherever you are, tell me. I really do read them, and it's the closest thing I know to being everywhere at once. Okay, back to the book. Now, I could just tell you its name and rush ahead, but I'd rather let it stay a little mysterious for a moment longer, because the mysteries inside it are the whole reason we're here. And there are several of them. Let me lay a few out for you, gently, like cards face down on a table. We won't turn any of them over just yet. That's for later, when you're even sleepier than you are now. Here's the first. Some scholars think there were around 15 copies of this book, and they weren't sitting in a grand library or a cathedral. They were buried, hidden away in caves out in the desert, sealed up in the dark, waiting. For centuries nobody knew they were there, and when they were finally found, they changed the way people understood the whole story. But we'll come to how they were found and what it meant much later. Here's the second. The book describes a calendar, and not the calendar you use, the one on your phone or your kitchen wall. A different one. Some say it counted exactly 364 days in a year. A clean, tidy number, the text seems to insist, the only correct one. And that strange little calendar, according to some, caused an argument. A real one that set people against each other. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, drifting off here in the quiet, that the number of days in a year could divide people so deeply, but it seems it did. Why that number? Why did it matter so much? Hold that question loosely. We'll return to it. Here's the third, and this one is stranger still. The book claims its contents were dictated, not written by a person sitting at a desk, but spoken aloud according to the text, by an angel reading from tablets that supposedly already existed, tablets that, the book says, were there before creation itself, before the mountains, before the seas, before the first morning. history waiting on heavenly stone, read down to someone here on earth. Some believe this. Some think it's an ancient way of dressing up much older ideas. Nobody can prove it either way. But it's a beautiful, dizzying thought to hold as you sink deeper into the pillow. And there's more woven through it. Figures called the Watchers, who according to the text came down and did something they were never meant to do. Giants. Whole stories that most people have never heard, sitting just outside the edges of the Bible most of us grew up with. Because that's the last strange thing, and maybe the strangest of all. This book was left out, quietly, not burned, not shouted down in the town square, just set aside, folded away from the pages that most of the world would come to call Scripture, as if someone gently closed a door on it and hoped it would be forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. That's the thing that gets me. A book that was pushed to the shadows, that lost its place, that should by every reasonable measure have simply vanished into dust, the way 10,000 other ancient writings did. And yet here it is, here we are, talking about it in the dark, thousands of years later. So here's my promise to you tonight, and it's a small one, easy to carry. By the time this story is over, and you may well be fast asleep long before then, and that is perfectly all right. That's the whole point. You'll understand why this book was quietly set aside, and more than that, you'll understand why it refuses to disappear, why it keeps surfacing again and again in desert caves and distant mountains and hushed arguments, insisting on being read after all. But to understand any of that, we have to start at the beginning, not the beginning of the world, the beginning of the book, who first claimed to receive it, and where and from whom. Because according to the story, this all began on a mountain, with a single figure and a voice that was not quite human telling him to write. And what that voice said next is where things start to get truly strange. So picture the mountain, not a gentle green hill, but a peak of bare stone rising out of the desert, wrapped in cloud, trembling at its roots. This is Mount Sinai, and the figure climbing it is Moses. You know the shape of this story already, even if you've never read a word of it. The 40 days, the 40 nights. The leader gone up alone into the smoke, while everyone below waits and waits, and wonders if he is ever coming down. That much has been told 1,000 times, but the book we've been circling tells it differently. And now, after all this waiting, it's time to say its name. It is called the Book of Jubilees. Say it softly to yourself. The Book of Jubilees. It's an odd, almost musical name for something so old and so strange, and it comes from the peculiar way the book keeps time. It doesn't count the years the way you or I would, one after another, in a plain long line. It gathers them into great cycles, bundles of years, folded into bundles, until you reach a unit the book calls a jubilee. Everything that ever happens in its telling happens somewhere inside one of these vast turning wheels of time. Creation falls in one, the flood in another. Every birth, every death, every quiet turning point is pinned to its exact place in the count. We'll come back to that clockwork later, because it hides one of the 4 mysteries, and it's the kind of detail that once started an argument that split a whole community. For now, just hold the name, and the sense that this is a book obsessed with when. So what is it, really? It's an ancient Jewish text, older than you might guess. Most scholars place it in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Some narrow that further, to somewhere around 160 or 150 BCE, though even then they'll tell you it was drawing on traditions far older than itself, stories already worn smooth by generations of retelling before anyone set them down in this particular shape. So it isn't the oldest thing in the world, but it's a very old window onto things that were already ancient when it was written. And here is what it actually does. The Book of Jubilees retells the Book of Genesis. It walks back through the beginning of everything, the creation, the garden, the first family, the flood, the long line of fathers and sons, and it carries that story forward all the way into the early chapters of Exodus, right up to the foot of that trembling mountain where we started. From the first day of the world to Moses on Sinai. The whole opening act of the human story told again. But told by whom? That's where it turns strange. In the version most of us grew up with, Sinai is a conversation between two figures. God speaks. Moses listens and writes. Jubilees keeps Moses on the mountain, keeps the 40 days and the 40 nights exactly, but it quietly adds a third presence to that scene. Because in this telling, it isn't only God who speaks. According to the book, there is an angel there. Not a small one of the very highest, a figure it calls the Angel of the Presence, one of those who stand closest to the throne, close enough to be in the room where nothing is hidden. And this angel is given a command, not to guard, not to fight, to speak, to dictate, to recite the entire sweep of history, from the first light of the first day onward, into the ear of a man sitting on a rock with something to write on. Imagine that for a moment in the drowsy dark, a man on a mountain top, a voice beside him that is not quite a human voice, and that voice beginning patiently at the very beginning of all things and simply not stopping. Now here's the strange part, the detail that makes the back of your neck prickle if you sit with it long enough. The angel isn't making it up. Read it carefully and you notice something the story is quietly insisting on. The angel of the presence isn't composing as it goes. It isn't inventing or remembering or piecing the past together from fragments the way a historian would. It's reading aloud. The words it gives to Moses are being copied from something that already exists, something already written down, waiting, complete. The book calls this source the heavenly tablets, and the angel is, in a sense, just the voice for them, a reader, a scribe, reading to another scribe. Sit with the oddness of that, the history of the world, of everything that had ever happened, and, according to some, everything that ever would, already set down in full before Moses ever climbed the mountain. The angel isn't the author. The angel is turning pages. We're going to open those tablets very soon, so I won't say more about them yet. Just let the image rest there in the dark. A written record, older than the man it's being read to, older than almost anything. And this is why the framing matters so much, why it isn't just a curious literary trick. Because of that setup, Jubilees doesn't present itself as a new story, or a rival story, or a story that argues with the one you know. It presents itself as the fuller one, the complete edition, the version with nothing left out. Think of the Genesis you may have half heard in a church, in a school, in a film. It moves fast, it's spare, it tells you a man and a woman were in a garden, and something went wrong, and they left. It tells you the world flooded, and one family floated. It tells you brothers quarrelled, and one killed the other. But it rarely lingers. It gives you the what and hurries past the who, the when, the why. So many figures pass by without names. So many years slide past without dates. So many terrible things happen for reasons the text never bothers to explain. Jubilees is Genesis with the lights turned up. The same familiar events, the same garden and flood and quarrelling brothers, but now with the names filled in. The exact dates pinned down to the year, sometimes to the day. The hidden motives spoken aloud. The causes behind the causes, the ones the version you know leaves politely in shadow. It's the behind-the-scenes cut of the oldest story ever told. The commentary track for the beginning of the world. It walks you back through every scene you thought you already knew and murmurs, in the calm voice of that angel, here is what was really going on. Here is the part they didn't tell you. You can see, maybe, why a book like that would make people nervous, and why, even so, it refused to quietly disappear. But that's a knot for later. For now, one thread pulls harder than all the rest, and it leads straight out of this section and into the next. Those tablets, the ones the angel was reading from. The book keeps returning to them, keeps pointing back over its shoulder at this written record that supposedly held the whole of history in advance. And the more you turn it over, the stranger the question becomes. Because a record of history has to be a record of something. It has to come after the events, not before. You write the story down once it's happened. That's what writing is for. So what were these tablets exactly? Where were they kept, and who wrote on them, and in what language? And the question underneath all the others, the one that keeps you awake even as everything else in you is finally going soft and heavy. How could a complete record of history already exist, finished, waiting to be read aloud before history itself had even begun? The book has an answer, and it is one of the strangest things ever written down. The tablets, according to Jubilees, are heavenly. They are kept in heaven itself, and on them is written everything. Not a summary, not the important parts. Everything. All of history, from the very beginning to the very end. All of law, every commandment and statute and ordinance. And all of time carved into neat divisions, the way you might rule a page into columns before you begin. The festivals are there, each one appointed and dated. The judgments are there, every reckoning that would ever fall on a person or a people. The fates of nations are there, who would rise and who would be scattered. And the names are there too, the names of the righteous written in one place, the names of the condemned written in another, inscribed. The text says, already inscribed, as though the ink had long since dried. Picture it for a moment, in the soft way you picture things now, at the edge of sleep. A record so complete that nothing is left out of it. A ledger of the whole world. Every harvest and every famine. Every king and every child. Every quiet death in a quiet house that no chronicle on earth would ever bother to mention. All of it, according to the book, set down in a language older than any tongue you have ever heard spoken, kept in a place you have never been, on tablets that no living hand engraved within the span of ordinary time. And here is the part that unsettles even as it soothes. Here is the claim that sits at the very centre of this whole story, the reason the title of this video is not a trick or an exaggeration. The book presents these tablets as existing before creation itself, before the world, before the first day, before there was a sky to divide from the sea, or a person to walk beneath it. The record came first. The tablets were already full. Think about what that means. Everything that would ever happen to Adam. Everything that would ever happen to his children, and his children's children, all the way down the long line to whoever you are and wherever you are lying right now. All of it, supposedly, already written, already finished, waiting. This is the literal meaning of history recorded before Adam. Not prophecy, where a seer glimpses something coming and warns of it. Not prediction, where a wise person reads the signs and makes a careful guess. Something colder and stranger than either, an already finished ledger. A book with no blank pages left in it, closed and shelved before the story it tells had so much as begun. Sit with that for a moment, let it turn over slowly in your mind. Because a record in every way you have ever known a record to work comes after. You live the day, and then you write it in your diary. The battle is fought, and then the historian sets it down. The event happens first, always first, and the record follows behind it, catching up, trying to remember. That is the natural order of things. That is the only order you have ever known. Effect follows cause. Memory follows the thing remembered. But here, in the world of this book, it is turned completely around. Here the record comes first, the tablets are written, and only then does the world unfold to match them. The events do not produce the record almost produces the events, as though history were not being lived so much as fulfilled, as though every day that dawned were simply the tablets, quietly coming true. It is a dizzying thought, and the book seems to know it, because Jubilees does not stop there, does not simply declare that everything is fixed and leave you in the cold. All through its pages it keeps speaking of choices. It speaks of righteousness as though a person might actually choose it. It speaks of sin as though a person might actually turn away from it, or fail to. It praises the ones who walked upright, and it mourns the ones who fell. And it does this as though their walking and their falling mattered, as though the outcome were not already sealed on a tablet in heaven with the ink long dry. Everything is written. And yet everything still seems to be at stake. How can both be true at once? The book never answers. It never resolves that tension, never sits you down and explains how a finished record and a free choice could share the same world without one of them being a lie. It simply holds them both side by side and lets them stand. And maybe that is the right way to hold them here tonight. Not as a problem to be solved, not as a doctrine to be argued over, one side against the other, the way people have argued for centuries and will go on arguing long after you and I have gone quiet. Just as a wonder, a strangeness the ancient world was content to leave strange. Some scholars think the book simply did not feel the contradiction the way we do. Nobody can say for certain, and you do not need to settle it to fall asleep. You only need to let it be large and old and unresolved, the way the best mysteries are. And here is where it drifts closest to you, quietly, without meaning to alarm you. I can feel you sinking deeper now, settling further into the warmth of wherever you are lying. So let the question come softly, this night of yours, this exact moment right now, the slow weight of your own eyelids, the breath going in and out, the particular way you're drifting off tonight and no other night. Is this the kind of thing that would be written on such a tablet? Somewhere in that endless heavenly ledger, on some line among the countless lines, is there an entry for the small unremarkable fact of you, here easing down towards sleep? The book would seem to say yes. Everything is there. Even this. Even the parts no earthly record would keep. And strangely, that is not a frightening thought at all. It is almost a comforting one. If everything is written, then nothing is lost. Not a single quiet hour goes unrecorded, not even this one. You can let go of it completely, let it slip out of your grip and into sleep, because according to the book, it was never yours to hold on to in the first place. It was already kept, already counted, already safe, somewhere far above you in a hand that does not forget. Rest into that. Let the day you lived be someone else's to remember tonight. But that only deepens the mystery, doesn't it, rather than closing it? Because if the tablets came first, if the record of everything was already complete, and waiting before there was a world to record, then a question opens beneath it, wider than the one before. What actually happened when the world was made? When the writing finally began to come true? When the first day arrived to match the first line? What did that look like? Jubilees tells the creation story too. It walks through those opening days the way Genesis does, and yet it is not the same story you half remember from childhood. It is stranger than that, and more crowded. There are more figures moving through those first hours than you were ever told about. Whole ranks of beings brought into existence before the first human ever drew breath, made and named, and set to their work on a day the book counts very carefully. Who were they, and what were they made to do? That is where we go next, into the crowded first days of a world being built to match a book already written. So let us go there, into the first days. Jubilees tells the creation story the way an accountant might tell it. That is the strange thing you notice right away. Where Genesis moves in broad, sweeping strokes, light, and then sky, and then land, Jubilees slows down and starts counting. It wants you to know exactly how many works were made, and on which day and in what order, as though the world were an inventory being taken in a great heavenly warehouse, item by item, each thing tallied and set on its shelf. The book says God made 7 great works on the first day. 7. It names them and it counts them, and it seems genuinely to care that you understand there were 7 and not 6, not 8. There is something almost tender in that tidiness, as if the person behind this book could not bear for a single created thing to go unnamed, as if love here looked like a careful list. And it is on that first day, in that careful list, that the book tells you something Genesis never quite does out loud. Because when Jubilees counts the works of the first day, one of the very first things it sets down on the page, before the dry land, before a single green thing, before the sun has been hung in the sky, is the angels. Not one kind of angel, whole classes of them made together in the very first hours of the world. The book lays them out in ranks. At the very top, it says, are the angels of the presence, the highest order, the ones who stand directly before God in the light closest to the throne. You will remember that phrase, angel of the presence, because it is one of those very beings who is said to be dictating this whole book to Moses. And then just below them, the angels of sanctification, the angels of holiness, set apart, the way the word means, kept for sacred things. And then, according to the text, the host opens up, because beneath those 2 high orders comes a whole crowded population of lesser angels, and Jubilees does something with them that is quietly astonishing. It assigns each of them a piece of the natural world to keep. There is an angel of the winds, the book says, the spirits of the wind that blow, an angel of fire, an angel set over the deep, the great dark waters below. And then it just keeps going, the way a child names everything they can see and cannot stop. The angels of the frost, of the hail, of the snow, the angels of thunder and of lightning, of cold and of heat, of the seasons, the winters and the summers, the springs and the autumns and all their turnings, of every natural thing. Sit with that image for a moment as you lie there, a world in which the frost has a keeper, in which somewhere behind the first cold morning there is a being whose whole task is the frost, where the thunder is not merely a sound but somebody's appointed work, where the hail comes down because an angel was set over the hail on the first day of everything and has been tending it ever since. Every gust of wind, every roll of thunder over distant hills, every white morning of frost on the grass, each one, in the world of this book, has a hand behind it. A named hand, a servant at a post. It turns the whole of nature into something staffed, something attended. Not a machine running cold and empty, but a great house full of quiet workers, each one bent over their own small corner of the weather, keeping it, minding it, moving it along. Now here is the thing worth holding on to, the thing this whole night keeps circling back toward. All of this, the angels of the presence, the angels of holiness, the whole busy host of wind and fire and frost, all of it is made on day 1, and Adam is not made until day 6. Do you feel the strangeness of it? Before there is a single human being, before anyone has drawn a first breath or opened a first pair of eyes, the heavens are already full, already ordered, already busy about their work. The universe in this book had a population long before it had any people in it. It was crowded before we ever arrived. Whole ranks of beings were made and named and sent to their posts on that first day, and by the time humankind finally appears, we are walking, late, into a world that has already been humming along for the better part of a week without us. We are not the first inhabitants, we are almost the last. There is a kind of humility in that, if you let it in, and a kind of comfort too. You were never alone in the emptiness. The book seems to say, there was never any emptiness. There was only ever a fullness you had not yet been born into. From there the book walks on through the rest of the days, still counting, still naming. On the second day the great vault of the sky, dividing the waters above from the waters below. On the third the land gathered up out of the sea, and the first green things, the grass, the seed-bearing plants, the trees, every growing thing rising up out of the fresh ground. On the fourth day, the lights, the sun and the moon and the stars, set into that new sky. And notice, just gently, what Jubilees says the lights are for. Genesis says they are for signs and seasons, but this book leans on it, presses on it a little harder, and it will keep pressing all through its pages. The lights, it says, are for the marking of time, for dividing day from night, yes, but also for the measuring out of days and weeks, and appointed times, and the sacred festivals that will one day be counted by them. The sun and moon are set in the heavens, in part, to keep a calendar. We will not open that door tonight, not yet, but feel the feather touch of it, there in the fourth day. Even the stars in this book have somewhere to be. Then the fifth day, and the waters and the skies fill with life, the great creatures of the sea and the fish, and every bird that flies. And the sixth day, and the land brings forth its animals, the cattle and the creeping things and the wild beasts, each after its own kind. And last of all, on that sixth day, into a world already crowded with angels and stars and living things, into a house long since built and lit and set in order, the human being, made last, made into the finished world, not the empty one. There is something about the way this book takes inventory of paradise that ought to make it feel colder, and yet it does the opposite. All that counting, all that naming, the 7 works of the first day, the keeper of the frost, the angel of the deep, the lights hung up to measure out the festivals. It reads like an inventory, and somehow the inventory makes it more wondrous, not less. Because an inventory is what you make of things you mean to keep. Each thing set carefully in its place, because each thing was wanted, because none of it was accidental. A made world, item by item, on purpose, every piece of it accounted for. And through all of it, this is what you start to feel as the days turn over. The book keeps coming back to one thing: time, days and weeks, and the marking of them. It counts the days of creation the way it counts everything, but it lingers on the counting itself, on the sevens and the Sabbaths, and the turning of the seasons, as though the calendar were not just a tool for measuring the sacred, but were itself among the most sacred things ever made. And that calendar, the one this book guards so fiercely, the one it hangs in the very stars, turns out to be one of the strangest and most quietly divisive things in the whole of Jubilees. That is where we go next, and time in this book is not just kept. It is counted, guarded, almost worshipped. So let's sit with that for a moment, here in the dark, and let the counting slow your breathing the way it seems to have slowed the breathing of whoever wrote this thing down. Jubilees gives you a calendar, a real one, with numbers attached, and it insists on those numbers the way a person insists on something they have been mocked for believing. The year, it says, is 364 days, not 365. Never a stray extra day tacked on at the end to make the arithmetic behave. 364, exactly, every single year, forever. And it is counted by the sun. Not glanced at, not estimated by the sun, counted by it, the way you might count coins into neat little stacks on a table. Now, on its own, that number could sound like nothing, a quirk, an old scribe's rounding error, but sit with it a little longer, and something strange starts to glow underneath it. 364 divides by 7, perfectly. No remainder, no leftover sliver of a day floating around unaccounted for. 52 weeks exactly, and then the year simply begins again. Which means, and this is the part that tends to catch people off guard, even now, even reading it cold, every date in this calendar falls on the same day of the week every single year. Forever. A festival that lands on a certain day this year lands on that same day next year, and the year after that. And 1,000 years later, if the count is kept, it lands there still. Think about that for a second. No drifting. No calendar committees arguing about which day a holiday should be observed on because the math got messy again. No slow, centuries-long creep where the date and the day of the week quietly come unglued from each other the way they do in the calendar you and I use without ever really thinking about it. In this book's world, the sacred times are locked, fixed, etched, the way everything important in Jubilees seems to be etched into something that does not bend to circumstance. There is a kind of comfort in that, isn't there? An order so complete it never needs adjusting. And there is also, if you let yourself notice it, something almost rigid about it. Beautiful, yes, hypnotic even the way any perfect pattern is hypnotic, but also unyielding in the way perfect things sometimes are. A clock that will not be reasoned with, and here's where the book starts to reveal its temper a little. Because not everyone around these people counted time this way. The world outside, the neighbours, the empires, most of the calendar's humanity has ever actually used watched the moon. And the moon is a beautiful timekeeper too, in its own way. But it is not a tidy one. Its cycles do not divide evenly into weeks. They slip. They drift against the days, month after month, so that a moon-based calendar has to keep patching itself, adjusting itself, catching up with itself, the way ours still quietly does with its leap years and its odd short February. Jubilees does not care for that. In fact, the book goes further than simply preferring its own solar count. It treats the moon reckoning almost as a kind of error walking around loose in the world. It warns gently but unmistakably against those who would go by the moon and disturb the sacred times by doing so. Not with fire and thunder, just with the quiet certainty of someone who believes they alone have been handed the real answer. According to the text, this 364-day count is not one option among several. It is the order fixed on the heavenly tablets themselves, laid down before the world existed. The one true rhythm that the sun, the moon, the stars, and every faithful person are simply supposed to fall into line with. And once you see that the book is building an entire architecture out of the number 7, you start to notice it everywhere, stacked upward like a tower. 7 days make a week, that much you already know. But in Jubilees, 7 years make something too, a week of years. And 7 of those weeks of years, 49 years all told, make a Jubilee. One single Jubilee. 50 years by the old counting, 49 by the book's own math. But either way, a great turning point, a unit big enough to measure a human life against. And then the book does something almost breathtaking in its audacity. It takes the whole span of history, from the first day of creation all the way to the moment its people arrive at the foot of a certain mountain. Sacred ground you may already know the name of, even if we're not naming it yet. And it lays the entire stretch out as exactly 50 of these Jubilees. 50. Not roughly 50. Not about 50, the way we might guess at the age of something old. 50, precisely, according to the book's own reckoning. Which is where this whole strange, sprawling account gets its name. Jubilees, history itself counted out in 50 great turns of the wheel, like beads counted one at a time along a very, very long string. Sit with that image for a moment before you drift further. A universe running like clockwork. Every day numbered. Every festival fixed to its weekday forever. Every stretch of 49 years folding into the next. All the way back to a beginning already written down, before there was a world to begin. It echoes something we touched on earlier, the sense that nothing in this book happens for the first time. Not really, that everything was already recorded on tablets older than the stars. The calendar is just that idea wearing a different coat. Time itself, pre-counted, time itself, already known. But here is the quiet, uncomfortable seed worth planting before we move on, and we won't dig it up just yet. A calendar this certain of itself, this convinced that it alone was handed down correctly, that everyone counting time by the moon was, in some sense, counting it wrong. is not the kind of calendar that sits quietly next to other calendars. Somewhere in the world this book came from, people kept the moon. People kept feast days that drifted the ordinary human way. And a book that tells all of them, gently or not so gently, that their sacred count is broken. That kind of book tends to make enemies quiet ones, patient ones, the kind of disagreement that doesn't erupt in a single dramatic moment, but instead simmers for generations until, one day, it decides which books get remembered as scripture and which ones get set quietly aside. We'll come back to that collision later. It matters more than it seems to right now. For the moment, though the great clock is wound and ticking, 50 jubilees deep, sevens stacked on sevens all the way up into the dark. And with that clock finally set in motion, the book turns its attention to someone very small standing at the very start of it all. A single man, freshly made, standing in a garden that Genesis barely described, a garden this book is about to fill in with details you have almost certainly never heard before. And here is where the book's obsession with the clock does something almost tender. Genesis tells you Adam was made. It does not tell you what happened next. Not really, not in any way you could put a number on. Jubilees cannot leave that alone. According to the text, Adam was formed during that first busy week of creation. But he was not. The book insists, placed in the garden right away. There was a gap, a waiting period. The text says something like 40 days passed between Adam's making and the moment he was finally brought into Eden, and Eve, formed a little later than Adam, waited even longer, something closer to 80 days, before she was allowed through the gate herself. 40 days for him, 80 for her, and the book ties these numbers, oddly, to the purity laws it will lay out much later for mothers after childbirth, as if Eden's opening morning was already, quietly, setting the pattern for rules that would not exist for centuries. Sit with that for a second, a paradise story, and someone in a heavenly archive somewhere is already counting the days like a clerk with a ledger. Most storytellers would have Adam open his eyes and simply be there amid the leaves, ready. Jubilees makes even Eden wait its turn. Picture it, if you can, without picturing it too vividly. A freshly made man, standing somewhere just outside the garden wall he has not yet been allowed to cross, 40 mornings ticking past him one by one, while inside, unseen, the trees are already heavy with fruit he has not yet been given permission to even look at. And once he is there, once the man is finally standing among the trees, Genesis barely bothered to describe, the book gives us the naming of the animals, a scene you already know at least in outline. But Jubilees adds something to it that Genesis never even hints at, something that, once you hear it, you may never read the animal naming scene the same way again. According to the text, in those first bright days the animals could speak. All of them. Every beast and bird and creeping thing shared one language with Adam and with each other. A single tongue running through every living throat in the garden. So that when the man named the ox and the sparrow and the serpent, the naming was not one-sided. They could have answered him. Imagine that for a moment, drifting here in the dark. A garden where nothing was silent, where every creature had a voice and used it, where language belonged to the whole of creation and not just to the two humans standing in the middle of it. And then, the text says, after the fall, after the fruit, after the shame, after the gate closed, that gift was taken back. Their mouths were shut. The single language was withdrawn from every mouth, but Adam's and Eve's and the world, this ancient book claims, simply got quieter. Not destroyed, not punished in fire or flood, just quieter. One small aching silence added onto every other larger one. Nobody can say for certain whether the author meant this literally or as some kind of poetic aside folded into a book already full of numbers and rules. But it is, whichever way you take it, one of the loneliest images tucked inside the whole of Jubilees, a world where the animals once spoke, and then on a particular day the book could probably tell you the date of, they didn't anymore. Because that is the other thing Jubilees does to Eden that Genesis never quite gets around to. It doesn't just describe a garden, it describes a temple. The text calls Eden the holiest place on the whole earth, holier, it says, than any mountain or shrine that would come after it, a kind of holy of holies, the dwelling place of the Lord himself, set down in the middle of the world before there were priests or altars or any of the machinery of worship that would come later. And Adam, in this telling, is almost a priest without knowing it. He tends the ground the way a priest tends a sanctuary. And when the fall comes and the gate finally closes behind him, the book gives him one more small, precise ritual before he steps out into the wider world. At dawn, it says, he burns a sweet-smelling offering, frankincense, galbanum, stacked, sweet spices, the very words the text uses, as if incense long before there was an altar to burn it on. A man lighting the first offering the world has ever seen, alone at the edge of a paradise that used to be his, and is now, quite suddenly, someone else's. Genesis gives you a curse and a sword of flame. Jubilees gives you that, and then it gives you a man kneeling at first light, with smoke curling upward, as though even grief needed its own quiet liturgy. The very first prayer, if you want to call it that, rising from the very last morning anyone would ever call that ground home. And it keeps counting even in the smallest corners of the story. The book notes, almost in passing, that Adam covered his nakedness once shame arrived, and it draws a line, gently but firmly, between the man and every other creature in the garden, none of whom the text points out ever felt the need to cover themselves at all. Only Adam, only the one made, supposedly in the image of something greater. It is such a small detail, it barely takes a sentence. And yet it sits there like a hinge the whole later story turns on. The moment a man became different from the beasts he had just finished naming. Then, at last, the reckoning the whole book has been building toward, since this is Jubilees and nothing here happens off the record. How long were they in the garden before it all came apart? The text places it at around 7 years, 7 years of that strange, slow paradise, of naming and tending, and, if the book is to be believed, animals that could still talk back before the fruit, before the serpent, before the date on the great clock that the author has already quietly been counting toward since the very first tick. That is the strange power of this version of the story. Most retellings of Eden lean into softness, into vagueness, into a paradise so perfect it barely needs describing at all. Jubilees does the opposite. It hands you dates. It hands you day counts and ingredient lists and a precise number of years, as if paradise were something you could take inventory of, shelf by shelf, before it was gone. And somehow that only makes the lost land harder, not softer, because grief measured in exact numbers is somehow more unbearable than grief left vague. 7 years, then gone, 40 days, then 80, then a gate shutting for good. A record-keeper's version of the saddest story in the world. But the book does not stop counting once Eden closes. If anything, it only gets started, because there is a question Genesis leaves hanging in the air for the rest of its pages, one that generations of readers have quietly wondered about and rarely gotten an answer to. When Adam and Eve's children go out from that ruined garden into the wide, empty world beyond it, who exactly do they marry? Genesis shrugs. Jubilees does not shrug. Jubilees remarkably names names. And Jubilees, unlike Genesis, does not leave you sitting with that question for long. The book answers it quietly, almost off-handedly, the way you might mention a detail you assumed everyone already knew. According to the text, Eve bore daughters as well as sons in that long stretch of years outside the garden, and the book even gives you their names. It says one daughter was called Awan. It says another was called Azura, and it tells you plainly who each one married. Awan, the book says, became the wife of Cain. Azura became the wife of Seth. Sit with that a moment. You don't have to do anything with it. Just notice it, the way you'd notice a shape in the dark before you understand what it is. In a world with exactly one family in it, Jubilee's reasons, there was no one else to marry. No neighbouring village, no travelling stranger, just the sons and the daughters of the same two people, and a future that had to come from somewhere. The book states this without apology and without embarrassment, the way you might state that water is wet. It was simply how the earliest world worked in the book's accounting. Brothers and sisters became husbands and wives, because the alternative was no future at all. Some scholars think this bothered exactly no one in the era the book was written for. That discomfort with it is a much later feeling, one we've layered on from the outside. The text itself doesn't flinch. It just writes the names down and moves on, the way a ledger moves on to the next entry. So Cain has a wife, and Cain has a brother. And you already know, somewhere in the back of your mind, where this is going. The book tells it simply, the way Genesis does, though it adds its own small details along the way. Cain works the ground, Abel keeps the flocks. Each brings an offering, Cain from the harvest, Abel from the firstborn of his flock, the fat and the choice parts, the best of what he has. And Abel's offering is looked on with favour, and Cain's is not, and something curdles in Cain that he cannot put back the way it was. Not loud, not sudden. A slow souring, the kind that sits in the chest for days before it finds a hand to move. And then, one quiet afternoon out in a field that had never seen violence before because there had never been enough people in the world for violence yet, Cain rises against his brother, and the world's first murder happens on ordinary ground, under an ordinary sky, and there is no thunder for it, no sign in the heavens marking the moment, just a brother's blood going down into soil that had only ever known rain before that day. The book doesn't linger on the details, and neither should you. It's enough to know that it happened, and that it was quiet, and that the quiet afterward was worse than any sound could have been. A field remembers something like that in its own way. So, the old stories say, does the ground itself. Genesis has the blood crying out from the earth, and Jubilees keeps that same hush of horror without needing to raise its voice. Cain is driven off. He lives out his years marked, unsettled, a wanderer in a world that is, technically, still only his own family. And here Jubilees offers you something Genesis never does. Genesis simply lets Cain walk out of the story and vanish into genealogy, his ending unrecorded. Jubilees will not allow that. The book cannot leave a life uncounted, not even his. So it tells you how Cain dies. According to the tradition the book preserves, Cain's own house collapses on him. The stones of the walls he lived inside, the very shelter he built for himself, come down in the end and crush him where he stands. And the book frames this, gently but unmistakably, as a kind of justice folded into the shape of the world itself. He killed with a stone, some traditions say, out in that field, and so, in the end, stone is what kills him. Not a lightning bolt from an angry sky, not a monster sent to hunt him down, just walls doing what walls eventually do at precisely the moment the account needed them to. A judgment quietly written into the architecture of things. The text seems to suggest rather than shouted down from above. Nobody can say for certain whether this detail come from a much older memory the book preserved, or whether it's the book's own addition, its own way of insisting that no wrong goes forever unanswered and no death goes forever unrecorded. But there it is, small and exact, filling in a silence Genesis was content to leave empty. And that hunger to fill silences, that's really the current running under everything Jubilees does from here on. Because once Cain's line and Seth's line begin to unspool, the book does something almost obsessive with the generations that follow. Genesis gives you the bare skeleton of this stretch of history, a name, an age, a son, and a then he died repeated down the page like a drumbeat. Jubilees takes that same skeleton and puts flesh on every bone of it, Where Genesis says only that a man had a son, Jubilees tells you the wife's name too, gives her a lineage of her own, ties her back into the same widening family tree. Where Genesis gives you a man's age at his death, Jubilees gives you the precise year on its calendar when he married, the precise year each child was born, the precise year at last when he was laid in the ground. Seth to Enosh, Enosh to Canaan, Canaan onward generation, folding into generation, each one slotted into its own exact place on that great sweeping clock of jubilees and weeks of years, the book has been keeping since the very first page. You may remember from earlier how careful this book is about counting, the tablets in heaven, the days measured out like clockwork, nothing in creation left to drift or guess. This is the same hand at work, just turned now toward people instead of days. It's as if the book cannot bear an empty space in the record. Not one name forgotten, not one year left blank. Every single person who ever lived in that first long age of the world, accounted for, held in place, remembered on purpose. And yet, even inside all that careful, patient counting, all those names, all those matching years, generation after generation ticking forward like a slow and faithful pulse, one name on that list refuses to lie still the way the others do. Everyone else in that genealogy lives out their years and dies, and the book notes it, and moves on to the next. But one man does not die like that at all. The record simply says of him that he walked with God. And then, one day, he is no longer there. No grave. No age at death. No ending, in the ordinary sense, at all. Just an absence where an ending should be, and the book, it turns out, has a very great deal to say about exactly where he went. His name was Enoch. Say it quietly to yourself, Enoch. In the book of Genesis he is given, in the end, only a single strange sentence to his name, that he walked with God, and was not, for God took him. That's all. No cause, no place, no last words. Just a man who was there, and then, somehow, was not. And you might wonder, the way you wonder about a door left slightly open in a dark hallway, what that sentence is even trying to tell you. Jubilees, this old and careful book, is not content to leave it there. It takes that single line and pulls gently on the thread, and what comes unspooled is an entire life you were never told about. According to the book, Enoch was the first human being ever taught the art of writing. Not the first to speak, not the first to think, not the first to dream, the first to take a mark and set it down where it would stay. Try to sit with that for a moment, the way you might sit with a candle flame, watching it, rather than looking through it. Before Enoch, in this telling, no human hand had ever done what you have done, 1,000,000 times without thinking about it. Held something that could carry a thought forward, past the moment it was thought, past the person who thought it, out into a future they would never see. And the book says his teachers were not other people. He learned it from the angels themselves. His schoolroom, if you can call it that, was not of this earth at all. Isn't that a strange and lovely thing to imagine? A young man, for the book does tell you he was young, in the earliest days of the world, when the air itself must have still felt new, sitting somewhere quiet, being shown for the first time how a line could become a letter, and a letter could become a word, and a word could hold a whole world inside it, by beings who did not need any of it themselves, because they already lived inside the record. He was being handed the very first pen, you might say, though of course there was no pen yet, only the idea of one. And he was the only person alive who had it. Think of everyone who came before him, all the way back to that first garden the book has already told you about. None of them could do this. Not the man who was shaped from the dust, not the woman who came after him, not their children, or their children's children. Whatever they knew only the way you know the sound of your own mother's voice, carried forward in memory, in the telling and retelling, softening a little more with every voice it passed through. Enoch was the first to fix a thing in place, the first to make a memory that did not need a living person to keep carrying it forward, Some scholars who study this old text call it one of the quietest, strangest claims in the whole of the book, bigger in its own way than the calendar, bigger than the generations of names, because it says that somewhere behind every word you have ever read, there is a night long before history properly begins, when nobody yet knew how to do that at all. And then Enoch did. What did he do with it, this first ever gift of writing? The book tells you plainly, and it is exactly what you might hope a first scribe would do. He wrote down the signs of the heavens, the order of the months, the careful movements of the sun and the moon and the stars across the dark, and the turning of the seasons that follow them, one after another, the way breath follows breath. He became, in this telling, the very first keeper of that great clockwork arrangement of time the book has already told you so much about, the quiet, patient order in the sky that never hurries and never truly stops. Before Enoch, that order simply was, turning overhead the way it always had, unwitnessed in any lasting way. After Enoch, for the first time, a human hand had written it down. Someone was keeping watch, someone was keeping count. And it did not stop with the stars. The book says he saw more than the sky. He saw somehow. The text does not linger long on how, what was, and what would be. He wrote down a testimony, a record of the generations still to come, long after his own had passed. Even the book claims something of the judgment of the world itself, the great and quiet reckoning that waits at the end of all these turning years. Think of what that means. A mortal man, holding for a moment something that had, until then, only ever existed far above him, in that other record you already know a little about. The tablets kept in heaven, written before the world was even made. Enoch does not write that record. He is only ever allowed near its edge. But he is the first mortal hand that ever comes close enough to touch it, and to carry a little of what it holds back down into this world, where the rest of us could someday read it. A bridge, you might call him, not quite of heaven, no longer only of earth. The first person to stand in that strange doorway between what is written above and what is lived below. And maybe that is what makes his story feel less like a folk tale and more like an ache, because a bridge by its nature belongs fully to neither side of the water it crosses. He had walked with God, the way the old line says. And now, it seems, he had been shown a little of what God already knew. What do you do after that with an ordinary life? How do you go back to counting days the slow human way, one at a time, not knowing what the next one holds, once you have glimpsed even the edge of a book where all of them are already written down? And then, where did he go? This is the part the book seems almost tender about, if a book of laws and calendars and generations can be tender at all. It says he was taken, led gently into a garden, a place the text sometimes calls Eden, sometimes simply paradise, as though it can't quite decide which word is large enough for it. And there, the book says, he remains, not dead, not resting in any grave that anyone could visit or mourn beside. Still writing, still recording, even now, the deeds of the sons of men, one generation quietly folding into the next, while he watches from that far and green and unreachable place. A witness set apart from death itself, the way a single candle might be set apart from a house, carried carefully outside before the fire ever reaches it. Doesn't that settle over you strangely, and rather softly as you lie there? Somewhere, according to this old book, there is a man who never died. He is not a memory. He is not bones under a stone. He is, if the book is to be believed, sitting even now in a garden none of us have ever seen, with whatever it is he writes with, keeping the record going. The seasons still turn for him the way he once wrote that they turn for us. Maybe there is a kind of quiet in that garden that none of us will ever quite feel, until the very end of our own years, if then. Maybe he has long since stopped feeling any hurry about any of it at all. Nobody can say for certain, of course. The book simply tells you it is so, and leaves you to picture the rest. But here is a small quiet thing worth noticing before you drift any further, because the book does not let Enoch's story end entirely in that garden of ink and green light. It says that Enoch, in all that writing, in all that watching, also wrote about certain other angels, not the ones who stayed where they belonged, singing whatever it is angels sing, keeping their places in that ordered sky he had spent his whole strange life recording. A different sort of company entirely. Angels who came down, who were sent to this earth, the book says, for a particular purpose, and who did not, in the end, keep to it. The book has a name for them. It calls them the Watchers. The Watchers say the word slowly, if you're still awake enough to shape it. It sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? Not a name for monsters. A name for something that watches. And that, the book insists, is exactly where their story begins, not with menace, but with care. Because here is where Jubilees quietly breaks from almost every other version of this old tale you might have half heard somewhere, in a sermon or a documentary or a conversation you can't quite place. In most of the tellings that survive, the Watchers are rebels from the very first page. Angels who looked at heaven and wanted something else. A mutiny in the sky, clean and simple, evil from the opening line. You can close your eyes on a story like that. It asks nothing of you. Jubilees does not let you off so easily. According to the book, the Watchers were sent down. Sent, mind you, not fallen, not fled, not cast out in disgrace. Sent by God himself on an errand that was, by every account the text gives, a good one. They came down to teach, to walk among the earliest generations of people and show them how to live, how to do what was right, how to build homes and treat one another with justice, how to shape a life out of the raw, unruly material of the young world. Imagine that for a moment, if you can hold the shape of it in your tired mind. Angels walking the earth not as punishment, not as temptation, but as teachers, as help. It's such a small detail, and it changes everything, because a story about angels who were evil from the start is, in its way, a comfortable story. It tells you that badness begins as badness, wears its true face from the first breath, and so you could always see it coming if only you looked closely enough. But a story about angels who were good, who were sent in love, who meant only to help, and who slowly became something else. That story doesn't let you rest quite so easily. That story sounds uncomfortably like people you've known. Maybe uncomfortably like yourself on your quieter, more honest nights. Think about what that first mission must have looked like, if you can picture it at all. Beings who had never known hunger or cold or grief, crouched by a fire with people who knew nothing else. Teaching a farmer how to read the turning of a season. Teaching a mother how to settle a dispute without it becoming a wound that never heals. Nobody can say for certain what those early lessons actually were. The book is more interested, as always, in the shape of time than the shape of a single afternoon, but the picture it leaves you with is almost sweet. Heaven leaning down close, trying to make the world a little kinder than it had been the day before. So how does a good mission curdle? The book doesn't say it happened all at once. There's no single scene of temptation, no one moment where a watcher looked at the sky and chose the dark on purpose. Instead, there is time. Years of it, maybe generations. The text is hazy on exactly how long enough for the earth to stop feeling like a posting and start feeling like a home. Long enough for the Watchers to live among the people they'd been sent to guide, to sit at their fires, to watch their children grow, to know their names. And somewhere in all that nearness, the book says, the Watchers began to look at the daughters of men. Not as students, not as souls to be taught, they looked and they saw that the women were beautiful. That's the whole of it, really. That plain, almost embarrassingly human phrase. They saw that they were beautiful, nothing thunderous, nothing that announces itself as the beginning of a fall, just noticing. just a glance that lingered a moment longer than it should have. You have to wonder how many mornings passed before anyone, even the watchers themselves, would have called it anything at all. A look held a beat too long across a well at dawn. A voice that a watcher found himself listening for before he'd admit he was listening. None of it, on its own, would have seemed like the end of the world. That's how these things move, isn't it? Not as thunder, but as weather. A warmth in a room that you don't notice building until you're already too warm to think clearly. Some scholars who've pored over this book point out how careful the language is here, how it resists giving you one dramatic hinge to point to. There is no verse where a watcher decides. There is only the slow accumulation of days in which wanting quietly outgrew watching. That's what makes it so unsettling, if you let yourself sit with it. This wasn't a war declared against heaven. It was desire, the most ordinary thing in the world, the thing that moves through every human heart 1,000 times a day without incident, working its way into beings who were never built to carry it. Beings of pure spirit, suddenly feeling something meant only for creatures of blood and breath and mortality. You have to wonder, don't you, what that must have felt like from the inside. To be something eternal and suddenly want in the small, urgent, temporary way that people want. And wanting left alone long enough tends to become taking. The book says the watchers took wives for themselves, human women chosen and claimed, bound to beings who did not belong to the earth at all. Try to picture it without picturing anything lurid, just the wrongness of the shape itself. Light married to dust. Eternity lying down beside something that was always going to die. Two kinds of existence that were never meant to touch, touching anyway, and something in the fabric of the world quietly tearing where they met. Not violent, not loud, just wrong, in a way that has no other word for it. A boundary that had held since the first morning, dissolving a little more with every year that passed. And isn't there something strange, something almost tender, in the way the book chooses to tell it this way? It could have made the Watchers villains from the start, and been done with it. Instead, it hands you good servants. Angels who came down to help, who meant every part of that mission, who wanted, in their own way, for the world to be better than they found it. And the same longing that undoes an ordinary person, the pull toward someone beautiful, the slow erosion of a boundary you always meant to keep, undid them too. There's something in that a person can feel low in the chest, in that space just under the ribs where the truest things settle, that the distance between a good intention and a ruined one might be so small, that it might not take a monster to lose your way. It might only take time, and nearness, and the simple, unremarkable fact of being made to want. Maybe that's why the story unsettles more than it should, this late at night, this far from anywhere. Not because it's about angels at all, really, because it's about how anyone slips, a little at a time, never on purpose, always by degrees. But something had happened now that the world had never had to reckon with before. A line that had never been crossed in the history of anything was crossed, in the flesh, in the quiet dark of ordinary tents and villages that had no idea what had just moved into them. And you have to ask, don't you, even half asleep, what happens to a world when heaven and earth mix like that? What is even born from a joining that was never supposed to happen at all? The book has an answer. It is not a soft one. It is not the kind of answer that lets you drift off easy, and maybe that's exactly why it belongs here, in the dark, in the quiet, where the strangest truths always seem to wait until you're almost asleep to tell themselves properly. Because what came of it, the text says, were children, but not the kind of children the earth had ever known how to hold. The giants were coming, and they grew, not the way a child grows, filling out a little more each season, but the way a shadow grows when the light behind it drops toward the horizon, fast and wrong, and somehow without you ever catching the moment it happened. The text doesn't linger on numbers, not here, but the tradition around it does, and the tradition says the giants stood taller than any door, any tree, any shape the earth had ever agreed to hold. Try to picture that for a moment, if you're still awake enough to picture anything. A figure crossing a field in the grey hour before dawn, and the field simply isn't big enough for it. They were not of heaven. They were not fully of earth either. They were something the world had never had to make room for before, and the world, it turns out, does not make room for such things gently. Think about that word the book sometimes uses for them, if it's easier to drift with a single word than a whole picture. Nephilim. Nobody agrees, even now, on exactly what it means. Some say it comes from a root that means to fall, the fallen ones, or the ones who caused others to fall. Others aren't so sure, but sit with the sound of it for a moment, low and heavy, almost a sigh. It doesn't sound like a name given in celebration. It sounds like a name given quietly by people trying to describe something they were still afraid of even in the telling. You'd think, maybe, that beings born of angels would carry something of that light down with them. Some scholars think the opposite is closer to the book's meaning, that whatever the Watchers had been, whatever brightness had once belonged to them, none of it survived the crossing into flesh. What was left in the giants was only appetite, only sighs, only a hunger that the earth had no name for yet, because nothing before them had ever needed to eat this much, or take this much, or leave this little behind. So they ate. The book says it plainly, and asks you to sit with it rather than look away. They devoured the birds, the beasts, the creeping things, the fish, the fruit of the fields, and when the fields could no longer feed them, they devoured each other. Imagine that, quietly, in the dark, not a battle, not a war with banners and reasons. Just hunger, meeting hunger with nothing else in between. There's no glory in it, the way the book tells it. No triumphant strength, no heroic wrestling of one great figure against another, the way later ages like to imagine giants, clashing, roaring, something almost thrilling to watch from a safe distance. This isn't that. This is smaller and sadder than that. It's creatures too large for the world, finding that the world could not sustain them, and turning on the only thing left close enough to reach. You're allowed to feel sorry for them, even now, even knowing what they were. Something in their making went wrong before they ever had a choice in the matter, and that is where the violence started, though it did not stay contained to them for long. The text says the earth was filled with it, violence and bloodshed, and a kind of corruption that spread the way damp spreads through a house nobody is tending any more, quietly at first in the corners, and then, one day, everywhere, and you can't quite say when it crossed that line. According to the book, it wasn't only the giants who went wrong. It was almost everyone, almost everything. All flesh, the text says, all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Every living thing that walked or crawled or swam had, in some fashion, wandered from whatever order it had first been given. And remember what this book loves. Remember the counted days from the very first section, the sun and the moon set into their courses, the years measured out in clean falls of 91, the ranks of angels moving through their duties like something choreographed since before the first morning. This is a book obsessed with order, with things staying exactly where they were placed. So picture, if you can, how that same careful mind describes the opposite, a world sliding ever so slowly out of every line it was drawn inside. The calendar still turning overhead, faithful as ever. And underneath it, the earth going feral. It's almost unbearable if you think about it long enough. The gap between those two pictures. Somewhere above, the sun keeps its perfect course, exactly on schedule, exactly where it was told to be on the very first page of this story. And somewhere below, on the same earth, under the same faithful sky, people are forgetting how to look at each other without violence in their hands. The book doesn't dwell on the contrast. It doesn't need to. It just lets you notice it, the way you might notice, half asleep, that the clock on the wall is still keeping perfect time in a room that has otherwise fallen into disorder. It's a strange kind of sorrow if you let yourself feel it. Not the sorrow of a single tragedy, but the sorrow of watching something good come slowly undone, degree by degree, none of it sudden enough to stop. The book has spent so many pages already loving this world into being. The waters gathered, the trees given their seeds, the animals given their kinds, the seventh day given its rest. And now, so soon after, that same world is described as spoiling. Not because it was made wrong, because something was let loose inside it that it was never built to hold. And here, the book says something Genesis never quite says outright, somewhere in its telling, in what later readers number as the 7th chapter, Jubilees, becomes almost blunt about it. The flood, when it comes, will not be only about human wrongdoing in the ordinary sense. It will not be only about the world's ordinary sins, the small daily failures of people being unkind to one another. It will be about this, the giants, and the blood they spilled, and the corruption the watchers loosed into the world by ever coming down at all. The water, when it finally comes, is described less like a punishment falling from a stranger's hand and more like a cleansing, like something washing a wound. The earth had been fouled, and the earth, in this telling, needed to be made clean again. Isn't that its own kind of quiet ache? A world made with such tenderness, measured out day by day, hour by hour, season folded into season with such patient love, and now that same world sliding gently, almost apologetically, toward the water that will cover it. You can almost hear the book itself grieving as it writes this part. Not gloating, not thundering, just sad. The way you might feel sad watching something you loved slip out of your hands, even knowing somehow that it has to. But even here, especially here, the book is already reaching past the grief toward something gentler, because it never once says everything will be lost. It says a family will be kept, one line, unbroken, will be carried through whatever is coming, the way a single lit window stays lit while a whole street goes dark around it. The corruption spreads. Yes, the violence spreads. And still, somewhere inside all of it, the book is quietly building toward mercy, the way it always does, the way it always will. So let the water gather at the edges of the story for now. Let it wait there, patient, the way it's been patient since before any of this began. There is a man coming. There is an ark coming. You already know that part, or think you do, because you've heard it before, in gentler versions, in 100 picture book tellings with 2 of every animal smiling out from under a rainbow. But Jubilees isn't finished with the giants yet. Not quite. Because the text says something Genesis never tells you, something about what happened when the giants finally went under the water with everything else, something about their bodies failing, drowning, dissolving back into the earth they had corrupted. And something, the book says, that did not go down with them. Something that was left behind, drifting loose in the world, long after the giants themselves were gone. The book does not linger at first on what that something was. It moves the way water moves. It has a family to save. You know the shape of this part already, don't you? A man called righteous in a corrupted age, a wife, 3 sons, their wives, a vessel built to hold them, and the animals and whatever quiet grief comes with knowing what is about to happen to everyone left outside it. Jubilees tells it briefly, almost gently, as if it trusts you to fill in the rest from memory. The sky opens, the deep breaks open beneath it, too, springs and fountains long sealed now rising to meet the rain. The water climbs over hills, over the tops of the tallest places, until there is nothing left above it but the one wooden shape carrying the only household's still breathing air. And then, in time, it recedes. The mountains reappear like shoulders breaking the surface of a bath. A bird goes out and does not come back. Another goes out and returns with green in its mouth. You have heard this 100 times in 100 voices, and the book knows that. So it does not slow down here. Its interest, its real interest, is in what the flood was actually for, and in what happened after the water had done its work and gone still. Because here is where Jubilees quietly parts ways with the story as you thought you knew it. The giants died in the flood. Of course they did. Nothing with a body could survive that much water, that much weight, that much cold, patient drowning. Their enormous forms, the text says, failed and dissolved and went back into the earth that had made them, the same earth their violence had spoiled. That part is almost expected. A monstrous generation undone by the very deluge their monstrousness caused. Neat, fitting. The kind of ending you'd nod along to in the dark and let yourself drift past. But the book will not let you drift past it, because the giants, it says, were never only bodies. They were something stitched together from two kinds of being, a heavenly father, an earthly mother, and when the earthly half failed, when the flesh gave out and sank, the other half did not go down with it. Something remained, something without weight, without shape, without a home any more in any body at all. Spirits, the text calls them, unclean spirits. The lingering, disembodied remainder of that entire drowned generation, loosed now into a washed and empty world, with nowhere left to belong, and nothing left to do but drift, and trouble the living wherever the living could still be found. Sit with that for a moment if you can, before sleep pulls you further under. A flood that was supposed to end the corruption instead scattered part of it into the air, cleansed the earth of bodies, and left it haunted by what those bodies used to carry. And this quietly, almost as an aside, the way the truly unsettling things in old books often arrive is where the book seems to suggest a whole later idea of demons actually comes from. Not fallen angels themselves, still bound and waiting in their dark places. Something closer to us than that, and maybe stranger for it. Ghosts, in a sense. Restless remnants of that hybrid, half-human generation, wandering because they were never buried, never let go, never finished. Some scholars reading Jubilees have called them exactly that, the specific origin story for the demonic, tucked inside a flood narrative in a book most people never open. Now into that scattering of loose and grieving spirits, the text brings in a figure, a name you may not know yet, though you may meet it again before this story is through. Mastema. He is described as a kind of prince among these spirits, their leader, their chief. Later ages would come to think of him as an accuser, an adversary, a shadow standing just at the edge of the divine court with his own quiet agenda. And when God moves after the flood, to gather up all these unclean spirits and bind them away somewhere the living can never reach again, sealed off, silenced, done, it is Mastema who steps forward. It is Mastema who asks for something. He asks that they not all be taken. The text is oddly specific about it. Not all of them, he says. Leave some. Leave a portion so that I might still have some means of testing, of tempting, of afflicting the descendants of the very people just saved from the flood. A working number is given. 1/10, the book says. 9 parts in 10 bound away, gone, finished, and 1 part left loose in the world, deliberately, by permission, to keep working on humankind exactly the way that whole drowned generation had worked on it before. And this is the part worth sitting with as you drift. The book says the request is granted. Isn't that a strange thing to imagine? Not evil slipping past some cosmic guard by accident. Not a loophole, a mistake, an oversight, a bargain. 1/10 allowed to remain on purpose, as though the story needed the world to still carry some measure of affliction in it, some small percentage of the old corruption walking loose at the edges of things, because a world with none at all would somehow not be a true test of what these rescued, restarted people were made of. The book doesn't explain why 1 in 10. It just states it plainly the way it states everything else, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. and leaves you to turn it over in the dark. But here is the gentler thread woven right alongside that hard one, and maybe it's the thread to hold on to as your eyes get heavier. Because at the very same time the book says the good angels, the ones who never fell, who kept their proper place, came down to Noah, and they taught him, not spells, not charms, remedies. Real physical knowledge drawn up out of the plants and the roots and the quiet substances of the earth itself, medicines, ways of treating illness, ways of protecting his children and his children's children from whatever those remaining spirits might still try to do to them. The first medicine, the book seems to say, given not by chance discovery, but as a direct answer to a specific danger. And Noah, careful man that he was, wrote it all down, recorded it in a book of his own, the text says, and passed that book on to one of his sons, so the knowledge would not drift away and get lost the way everything else almost had. A small light handed forward against a very large night. So maybe that's the shape to carry with you now as this one settles. The flood ended the giants. It did not end their shadow. Something of that old corrupted age still moves at the margins of the world, the book imagines, thin and reduced, 1 part in 10, but present. And yet the very first answer to it wasn't fear. It was knowledge. It was care. A remedy written down and passed hand to hand, quietly, patiently, long before anyone thought to be afraid of the dark in quite the way we are now. There's something almost restful in that, isn't there? Almost enough to sleep on. And this strange, careful, specific little book, with its heavenly tablets, its exact calendar, its fallen watchers, its bound and unbound spirits, its 10th left walking loose in the world. This book that remembers so much the more familiar version of the story leaves out, went quiet itself, not long after. For close to 2,000 years it survived only in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of other people's memory, and much of the world came to believe it was simply gone. Lost the way old things get lost, until one day, in a desert, in the middle of the 20th century, someone reached into a cave. A cave, remember, somewhere in the hills above the Dead Sea, where the air is dry enough to keep a secret for 2,000 years. The story most often told, and scholars will tell you it has softened and shifted a little in the retelling. The way good stories do is that it was a Bedouin shepherd, sometime in 1947, throwing a stone into a dark opening in the rock, listening for a goat that had wandered off. And instead of a bleat, he heard something break. A clay jar, maybe. Something old, cracking in the stillness. You can picture it, can't you? The heat easing off the stone as the sun goes down. The particular hush of a desert at dusk, when even the wind seems to be listening. And inside that cave, jars, tall, sealed, waiting in the dark the way only very old things know how to wait. Inside the jars, scrolls, leather and papyrus rolled tight. The ink faded to the colour of tea, but there, legible, alive in a way. It would turn out to be one of the great manuscript discoveries in the history of the world. Not one cave, as it happened, but eventually 11 of them, scattered along the cliffs near a place called Qumran, yielding scroll after scroll, fragment after fragment, across the years that followed. Bits of leather no bigger than a coin. Long sheets rolled around wooden rods, brittle at the edges, softened only by the careful hands of the people who found them. Tens of thousands of pieces in the end, painstakingly matched and pieced together by scholars working, it said, for decades. A puzzle the size of a small library scattered across a desert floor and reassembled letter by letter, under lamplight, in quiet rooms far from the cave where it all began. News of it moved slowly at first, the way real discoveries often do, long before anyone understood what they'd actually found. A dealer here, a scholar there, turning a fragment over in his hands, feeling the weight of something he couldn't yet name. And only gradually, over months, then years, did the picture come into focus. These weren't just old scraps. These were some of the oldest biblical and biblical-adjacent manuscripts anyone had ever laid eyes on. Older by roughly 1,000 years than almost anything scholars had been working from before. Among all of it, and here is where our story quietly rejoins the larger one, were copies of the very book we've been following through this evening, the Book of Jubilees, sealed in the dark of those caves for nearly 2,000 years, and pulled back into the light in the language it was first written down in. Not a translation of a translation, not a distant echo passed hand to hand through Ethiopic scribes, though we'll come to that. The original Hebrew, the way it had first been set to parchment all those centuries before. Sit with that for a moment if you can, before sleep pulls you further under. A book the wider world had let go of, a book most people, if they'd heard of it at all, assumed was gone, swallowed by time, by neglect, by whatever it is that erases most of what humans ever write down. And there it was, waiting under the desert, waiting, it almost seems, to be found. And here is the part that tends to surprise people, even scholars who thought they knew what to expect. It wasn't one copy, it wasn't a single scroll tucked away like a private treasure, one careful scribe's quiet devotion. Researchers working through everything pulled from those caves came to identify roughly 15 separate copies of Jubilees. 15. Spread across 5 different caves, at different times in different hands, some in careful practice script, some rougher, hurried, as if copied by candlelight against a deadline only the scribe understood. Let that number settle. 15 copies of one book, surviving, even in fragments, after 2,000 years in the ground. That is not what happens to a text nobody cared about. That is not an accident of preservation. Manuscripts like this don't survive by chance alone. They survive because someone again and again thought them worth the labour of copying. Because a community kept reaching for this particular book, generation after generation, and choosing to make another copy and another. And when you set that number beside the other texts found at Qumran, when you ask of everything in that library hidden in the rock, what did they copy the most? The answer reframes the whole evening. By many counts, Jubilees sits at or near the very top. Third, some scholars say, behind only the book of Genesis itself and the writings gathered under the name of Enoch, that same Enoch we spent time with earlier tonight, walking with the watchers, learning what the angels knew. Third, ahead of many of the books that ended up, centuries later, bound into the Bible that most people around the world now read. Think about what that means. To the community that hid these scrolls in the desert, a community scholars believe held these words close, studied them, shaped their calendar and their daily life around what these scrolls said. Jubilees was not some strange, marginal curiosity. It was not a rumour of a book whispered about at the edges of respectable belief. It was central, treasured, copied and copied again, the way you copy the words you cannot afford to lose. Something very close to Scripture itself. And it wasn't only copied. Scholars have found other scrolls at Qumran that quote Jubilees outright, lean on it, treat its version of events as settled fact, the way you might quote a book you consider simply true, rather than one you're merely curious about. Whoever these people were, they weren't holding Jubilees at arm's length. They had built parts of their own worldview on top of it, and the dating only deepens the quiet weight of it. Scholars believe the copies found in those caves were themselves written out somewhere around 125 years before the start of the Common Era, copies of a text that had already been composed a little earlier than that, pushing its origin back well over 2,000 years from tonight. Which means this book, this strange, careful, counted history, reaching back before Adam, before the garden, before the first sunrise, is not a medieval invention. Not a modern forgery, dreamed up to unsettle people centuries later. It is ancient, genuinely, provably ancient. People were holding these words, copying these words, hiding these words away for safekeeping more than 2,000 years ago. long before most of what you'd call old in the world today. So picture it again, if your eyes are already closing. Picture those jars, sealed tight in the dark of the caves, holding this small, careful accounting of time. Tablets and years and jubilees within jubilees, while up above, empires rose and fell. Rome came and went, centuries turned over like pages nobody was reading anymore. The world above forgot the book had ever existed at all. And down in the dark, cool and still, it simply waited, the way the very first tablets in the story waited to be copied down. The way old things, if they're patient enough, sometimes get to be found again. But here is the strange small ache sitting underneath all of this, the question worth carrying with you as your eyes close a little further. If this book was so treasured, if it was copied more times than most of the books that did make it into the Bible people read today, if the very community that helped preserve the Bible's oldest surviving words also clearly loved this book, kept it close, returned to it again and again, then why isn't it there? Why isn't Jubilees sitting quietly between Genesis and Exodus in the book on your shelf, or your grandmother's shelf, or the one at the back of a hotel room drawer? Why did a text this beloved, this carefully guarded, slip out of the pages that almost everyone else would eventually come to read? Who closed that door? And why? Here's the honest answer, and it might not be the one you expect. There was no bonfire, no council of stern men banging a gavel and declaring by name that this book was forbidden. Nobody drew a black line through Jubilees and sealed the order in wax. The truth is quieter than that, stranger too in its own soft way. It didn't get thrown out, it drifted out, a little further every generation, a little further from the centre, until one day someone reached for a Bible and it simply wasn't there anymore, and by then almost no one thought to ask why. Forbidden is too strong a word for what happened to this book. Banned makes it sound like a decision, made once by someone with the authority to make it. What actually happened was slower and more human than that. It was quietly set aside, left off, allowed to fall out of the rotation of what got copied, what got taught, what got carried forward into the next century and the next. And if that sounds almost gentle, in a way it was, which somehow makes it sadder. So let's start with the reason we planted a seed for earlier, the calendar. Do you remember it? That insistence running through the whole book that there is exactly one correct way to count the days of the year. 364 of them, divided so cleanly into weeks and seasons that every festival lands on the same day of the week, every single year, forever. Jubilees didn't propose this shyly. It didn't say, here's an option, take it or leave it. It said, this is the calendar of heaven itself, written on tablets before the world began, and any other way of counting time is a corruption, a straying, an error serious enough to throw the entire sacred calendar into chaos. And here's the trouble. The tradition that grew into what we now call Rabbinic Judaism didn't settle on that calendar. It settled on one tied to the moon, a lunar or lunisolar reckoning, needing the occasional extra month inserted just to keep pace with the sun. Practical, flexible, and, according to Jubilees, wrong. Not just different, wrong in a moral and cosmic sense, wrong the way stepping outside of God's order is wrong. Try to sit with that for a second, sleepily, the way you might sit with an old grudge you can't quite explain to someone else. Imagine a book arriving in your household that tells you gently but absolutely that the way you and your parents and your grandparents have always kept the holy days, the way woven into the rhythm of your whole life, is a mistake. Not a small mistake, a cosmic one. How warmly would you welcome that book onto your shelf? How likely would you be to keep copying it, teaching it to your children, reading it aloud at the table? The calendar Jubilees loved so fiercely, guarded so absolutely, is part of what sealed its fate. It made itself an argument the emerging mainstream could not accept. And a book that argues with you about your most basic sense of time is not a book you keep close. Scholars who study this period are careful here. Nobody thinks a single furious rabbi tossed the scroll aside in one afternoon over a calendar dispute. It's subtler than that. It's the kind of disagreement that just makes a text a little harder to use, a little more awkward to read aloud in a service built around a different rhythm entirely. Copy it less, teach it less, let it slip, quietly, toward the edges of the shelf. That's reason one. Here's reason two, and it's a softer thing, a change in fashion almost, except fashions of the soul. Jubilees is full of angels and demons doing very active, very consequential work in the world. The watchers sent down from heaven falling into corruption. Mastema dark and scheming, commanding a full tenth of the spirits under his hand. The ghosts of giants becoming the demons that plague humankind afterward. It's a crowded, vivid, almost cinematic supernatural landscape. And in its own time, the Second Temple period, the centuries before and just after the turn of the era, the same world that gave us the Enoch writings, none of this was strange. It was simply how many people understood the unseen order of things. Angels descending, spirits warring, a whole architecture of heaven pressing down into ordinary life. But traditions shift, the way a house settles over decades, so slowly you don't notice until one day a door won't close the way it used to. As later religious thought consolidated as it worked out over generations what belonged at its centre and what belonged at its edges, that elaborate world of fallen angels and named demons and spirit kings began to feel less essential, a little too strange, a little too far from where the centre of gravity had moved. Not secret, not hidden, just peripheral now, in a way it hadn't been before. Ideas that were once simply part of the furniture of belief slowly became the things whispered about instead of taught outright, and a book built entirely from that furniture drifted to the edges along with it. Part of the reason, then, seems to be nothing more dramatic than a slow change in what felt central and what felt like the margins. Nobody voted the Watchers out of belief. Nobody held a hearing on Mastema. The world around the ideas simply kept turning, gently, until they no longer fit quite where they once had. And then reason 3. This one is less about ideas and more about paperwork, if you can forgive so plain a word for something so consequential. In the early centuries of Christianity, as churches across a scattered, arguing, deeply devoted world tried to settle exactly which books counted as scripture, lists started getting made. Councils met, synods convened. You can point to one, the Synod of Laodicea in the 4th century, somewhere around the year 363, where the accepted books were written down, one by one in order. And Jubilees was not on it. That's really all that happened in the end. Not a denunciation, not a debate that we can find, no scandal, no scene where someone stood and argued passionately against including it. Just an absence. A name left off a list, the way a name gets left off a guest list, not out of malice, sometimes not even out of a real decision, just because somewhere along the way it stopped being who was gathered around the table. So there you have it, not one door slamming shut, 100 small doors easing closed over centuries. A calendar that made it inconvenient, a supernatural vision that drifted out of fashion. Canon lists drawn up in council rooms far from Qumran's caves that simply never wrote its name down. Add all those quiet exclusions together, and you get a book that vanished from most Bibles without anyone, anywhere, ever quite deciding in one clean moment to erase it. That is how most forgotten things are forgotten, isn't it? Not with a bang, with a long, soft silence. A slow lowering of the lights, so gradual that no one can name the exact moment the room went dark. There's something almost tender in that, if you let yourself feel it. A book treasured enough to be copied more than almost any other scripture at Qumran. Read, cherished, hidden away in jars in the desert by people who loved it enough to protect it with their lives. And still it slipped through history's fingers. Not through violence, through drift. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, lying here in the dark, how many other voices went quiet the very same way, not silenced, just let go of, slowly, by people who never meant any harm by it. Hold that thought gently, let it settle over you like a blanket instead of a weight. And yet, here is the part of this story that turns everything. The part that gives the whole long drift its strange, stubborn little light at the end. Because in one corner of the world, behind mountains, past borders that kept it apart from all this slow forgetting, there was a church that kept its own counsel, its own list, its own memory, and in that place, Jubilees never left the Bible at all. In one place, right now, tonight, it is still Scripture. That place is Ethiopia. Not a footnote of Ethiopia, not a dusty corner of it. The living heart of it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth, tracing its roots back some 17 centuries, and it has always done something the rest of Christianity, over time, stopped doing. It kept a bigger Bible, a wider one. Scholars will tell you the Ethiopian biblical canon is the largest in continuous use anywhere in the Christian world, holding books that other traditions quietly set down centuries ago and never picked back up. And inside that canon, sitting there beside Genesis and Exodus and the Psalms, is the Book of Jubilees. Not as apocrypha, not as a curiosity kept in a side room for scholars to poke at, not as something whispered about or half forbidden, just Scripture, read aloud in services, copied by monks, taught to children, as canonical in that tradition as anything else between its covers. And it wasn't only the Christian church that held it close. In the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Beta Israel, whose roots in that land are themselves impossibly old, Jubilees was treasured too, read and honoured in its own right, separate from any church calendar. One book, two communities, side by side on the same soil, worshipping in different houses, and yet both of them, quietly, without needing to agree on much else, refusing to let this one text go, long after almost everyone else on the planet had stopped remembering it existed at all. It's worth pausing on how unusual that is. Ideas rarely survive twice over, in two separate traditions, in the same small stretch of land, purely by coincidence. More likely, scholars believe, it points to just how old and how deep this book's roots had already grown there, long before either community wrote down when it arrived. By the time the rest of the world had let Jubilees slip through its fingers, in that one highland country it had already settled in for the long haul, in more than one household of faith. Now, here's the part I want you to sit with, because it's the quiet, beautiful hinge this whole story turns on. You remember from earlier how the original Hebrew all but vanished. How, for centuries, there was no whole copy anywhere. Just a name in old footnotes, a citation in someone else's argument, a rumour of a book. And you remember those jars in the desert, how a handful of Hebrew fragments came back up into the light after 2,000 years underground, and how the discovery sent scholars practically running through the sand. But fragments are just fragments, pieces, a sentence here, a paragraph there. What those caves gave back was not the whole book, only whispers of it. The whole book, though, the complete text, start to finish, every chapter, every strange and dizzying detail we've walked through tonight, survived in only one place. Not in Hebrew, not in Greek, not in Latin, not in any of the languages you'd expect to carry something so old. It survived in Ge'ez, the ancient sacred language of Ethiopia, a language that most of the world has never once heard spoken. Ge'ez itself is a quiet marvel. It stopped being anyone's everyday tongue centuries ago, the way Latin did in the West, and yet it never stopped being used, held in reserve for exactly this purpose, for scripture and liturgy and the careful, patient work of scribes. And scholars today will tell you plainly that the only complete versions of Jubilees we have, the only manuscripts that let us read the whole story rather than guess at the missing pieces, are written in that language. Everything else, every translation into English or French or German that you might find in a library now, was built by working backward from those Ethiopian pages. Without them, this would be a book of holes, a shape we could sense but never quite see. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere in scriptoriums and mountain churches, generation after generation of scribes, who had never heard of the Dead Sea, who would never know their names, copied out this book by hand, line by line. Not because they were preserving a relic, because to them it simply was the Bible. It was never lost to them at all. It was just theirs, read on ordinary Sundays, sung in places the way Scripture is sung, passed from a teacher to a student, and that student to the next, in an unbroken thread, stretching back well over 1,000 years. Everywhere else the book was forgotten so thoroughly that people forgot they'd forgotten it. In Ethiopia nobody ever put it down, and isn't that a strange kind of grace? Two kinds of survival happening at the very same time, without either one knowing about the other. In one place, Hebrew scrolls buried in clay jars, sealed in silence, waiting in the dark for someone, someday, to come looking. And in another place, entirely unconnected, a living text, out in the open the whole time, held in human hands, spoken in human voices, never once needing to be rediscovered, because it was never actually gone. The scrolls in the desert had to be found. The Ge'ez text never had to be found. It just had to be visited. And that, if you remember all the way back to the start of tonight, is the second promise this story owed you. We asked at the very beginning how a book like this could slip almost entirely out of memory, and yet somehow never quite disappear. How something with tablets before creation, with angels arriving before Adam even opened his eyes, with a whole calendar written into the turning of the stars, with watchers falling and giants walking and restless spirits left behind to wander the earth long after the flood had gone down. How a story that strange could come this close to vanishing forever, and not. Now you know why. It was never entirely lost, because somewhere someone never stopped reading it. A thing is only truly forgotten when the last person who remembers it finally lets go. And here, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone in the wider world even noticing, no one ever quite did, for over 1,000 years, while the rest of Christendom moved on to other lists and other councils, someone, somewhere in those highlands, opened the same pages and read the same lines, and closed the book, and opened it again the next year, and the year after that, on and on, unbroken. So think for a moment of what that really means. All this time, while you were growing up, while almost everyone you've ever known was growing up, never once hearing any of this, these stories were still being spoken aloud, somewhere, in a language most of the world has never heard. Under the same sky that's over you right now, in the dark as you're lying there listening to my voice instead of yours. Tablets carved before the first morning, angels older than the taste of fruit. A calendar hung in the stars like a promise. All of it still moving quietly through the world this whole time, in a small stone church on a mountainside, in the mouths of people who never once let it fade. The book is still out there, still whispering its own strange older answer to the oldest question there is. And we've followed it now almost the whole way home, from before the first sunrise to a quiet church up on that mountain, still standing, still lit, still full of voices. There's just one thing left to say about it, and then, if you're ready, we'll let the whole story rest. Just one thing left to say. So let your shoulders drop a little further, and let's say it slowly. Think back if you can without opening your eyes. Not to remember hard, just to let it drift by. One more time, like the last few houses passing outside a train window before the lights go out. Tablets that were already written before the world had a single morning on it. Angels made on that very first day, quietly at work before there was anyone to see them working. A calendar counted out in such careful, patient numbers, 50 jubilees worked out to the day, as if someone somewhere truly believed that time itself could be tidy. A garden with details so exact you could almost have stood in it. 2 sisters with names, in a story that usually forgets to give them any. A brother lost in the first small, terrible act of anger the world ever knew. A man who never had to die at all, and who spent his long, strange life simply writing things down. Some higher, brighter figures who came down to help, and, in helping, slowly lost their way. Their enormous children, and the trouble that followed them across the whole earth. Water rising and rising, patient as the tablets themselves. And what was left over afterward? The restless spirits, and the one who asked to keep a small, quiet portion of them, so that even a peaceful world would still have a little shadow left in it, just enough to test what a heart is really made of. And then the long, long quiet. Centuries of sand and stone, a jar in a dry hillside cave, holding the book the way a hand holds something it isn't ready to let go of. And then one ordinary day in the middle of the last century, someone found it, opened it, read words that hadn't been read by anyone in almost 2,000 years. Most of the world had already set this book aside by then, quietly, the way you set aside a letter you meant to answer and never quite did. But not everyone had let it go. Up on that mountain, in that small stone church we found at the end of our journey, they never put it down at all. They kept reading it, out loud, generation after generation. The whole time everyone else believed it had gone silent forever. So here's the last small thought, the one worth holding on to as you drift. The book never once says it invented anything. That's the strange, quiet claim underneath all of it. Not I'm telling you a story, but I am copying one. A record already finished, already sealed, long before the first sunrise, before the first breath, before there was anyone at all to need a history. Just read aloud faithfully to a man on a mountain by someone who had seen it with tablet-clear eyes. Was that true? Was there really a timeline waiting there before Adam, before the water, before any of us, already written down somewhere no hand could reach? Or was this simply what people have always done in the dark, when the questions get too large for one small life to hold? Reach for an order finer than the one we actually live inside. Reach for tablets when all we really have is memory. Reach for certainty when what we're given is mostly wonder. Nobody can answer that for you. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And that's all right. More than all right, really. Some questions were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be held, loosely. The way you're holding this one right now, right at the very edge of sleep, where holding on tightly isn't even possible anymore, and you find you don't need to. There's a real comfort in a mystery you're simply allowed to rest inside. No answer required, just the shape of the question soft in your hands while everything else goes quiet. And maybe that's why a story like this belongs here, at the end of the day, in the dark, in a voice this low. The oldest questions were always asked this way. Not shouted in daylight, but wondered quietly by someone lying still, staring at a ceiling or a sky, asking how any of it began. You're not the first person to lie in the dark and wonder that. You're one more in a very long, very old line of people who did exactly this night after night, going all the way back, maybe even back to whoever first imagined tablets before the world. If this story kept you company tonight, that's really all it was ever meant to do. So if you'd like, leave a small like on your way out. It helps more than you'd think. And if you'd like more of these evenings, more strange old books and quiet, half-true histories to fall asleep to, consider subscribing so the next one finds you gently whenever you need it. And if you're still awake enough, just barely, leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there right now. We love reading those, someone typing at midnight, Someone just waking into dawn on the other side of the earth. Someone half asleep already, thumbs slow on the screen. All of you, scattered across every time zone this spinning world has, somehow tucked into the very same quiet story, at the very same time, in your own way. It's a small, lovely thing, and it's real, and it happens every single night. But for now, you don't have to do any of that. Not yet. For now, just breathe. Let your hands rest. Let the room be dark and kind around you. Whatever questions came home with you tonight, you can set them down gently right here and pick them up again some other time, if you ever want to. You did nothing wrong by not knowing the answer. Nobody does. Sleep now, you're safe, and you're held, and the story can rest too. Good night.